We continue today with our Out of the Box series. And as you remember, week before last, we looked at Out of the Box in terms of Mary's story. Then last week, we looked at Out of the Box in terms of Joseph's story. And today, we move into looking at it from a family perspective. So if you'd like to follow along, we have a couple of very short passages we'll be reading, starting with Luke 1, verses 36 and to 37. Luke 1, verse 36. Even Elizabeth, your relative, is going to have a child in her old age, and she who was said to be barren is in her 6th month, for nothing is impossible for God. And then over to Mark 31. Mark 31, and we'll be reading 31 through 35. When Jesus' mother and brothers arrived, standing outside, they sent someone in to call him. A crowd sitting around him, and they told him, "Your mother and brothers are outside looking for you." "Who are my mother and brothers?" he asked. And then he looked at those seated in a circle around him, and he said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does God's will is my mother and sister and brothers." God's word for God's people. Thanks be to God. So here, as we enter into this 3rd week of Advent, we have the opportunity to hear the Christmas story from another perspective, the perspective of family, something that is quite central to our Christmas experience, quite central to this idea of celebrating Christmas. So as we approach the birth of the Christ child, we are reminded through this story that it's also time to step out of the box and live outside of anything that tries to hold our faith back from the fullness to which Jesus calls us. Any attempt to contain our faith is more of society's box than a faith box. This includes being careful about the box that society, that culture tries to put around us in the materialistic approach to Christmas. So as we've talked about Mary's story and we've talked about Joseph's story, today we'll talk about how God, through opening up the box, has also redefined the idea of family. Consider how God stepped out the box when he chose this family through whom his son would be born. We hear in Luke 1:36 how he sets the stage, if you will, for this redefinition of what family means when he stepped out for a real out-of-the-box experience as he blesses a barren old woman who had had no children. And here we hear she is pregnant. This relative, as our NIV calls it, some of your Bibles may call it a cousin. Frankly, I kind of go with the cousin piece. I'm a good daughter of the South, and if they're related, they're your cousin. All right? So I'm thinking that's what Mary would have probably done here. She'd have probably claimed Elizabeth as her cousin, some kind of kinfolk. But whatever her age is, we know she's beyond the normal childbearing years. And in the culture of that time, that probably meant she was at least in her late 40s, maybe into her 50s. So a little bit beyond the ticking of the biological clock, we'll say her alarm had probably rung. And so she's a barren old woman. Well, today, because of modern science and because of the miracles that our scientists have been able to discover and physicians have been able to bring, that age of childbearing has been pushed back a little. It's a little longer now because science can intervene and help bring a pregnancy to those who might never have dreamt of being pregnant because of their age. But we hear about this woman, Elizabeth, an older woman, becoming pregnant. I can identify with her a lot because 15 years ago today, I gave birth to my 3rd child. And I was quite the Elizabeth too, because 43 was pretty old to be having a baby. But God doesn't have anything that's too impossible for him. And so even as I celebrate today personally the birth of my daughter, I also celebrate that God chose to get outside the box and bring a child who would herald the coming of the Messiah through this barren old woman. You see, even as I was a ripe old age of 43 and actively attempting to find the geriatric maternity ward, I knew that God had blessed me. And I knew that even though most of those perky 20-year-olds who were also having a bump in the front, I know that Mary must have felt like that. Elizabeth must have felt like that in her own village too. What must it have been like to have been gray in hair and walking around your village where you'd been known by everyone as that barren one? You know, it was somewhat of a stigma back in the culture of that time. They were an agrarian culture and they depended on the land. And in order to work the land, they needed a lot of help. So families depended on having many sons so that in their old age they would have the help they needed to survive. So she was given the greater blessing even than just bearing a child, for in that society bearing a son was indeed a large blessing. So here, in the midst of Mary's own joy, of having been selected to be the one blessed among women, we hear Elizabeth's story, how she too participated in what would have been considered impossible. She became the mother of John. Two very unusual stories, two stories that are both outside the box in anyone's definition. The story of a virgin who became fruitful to bear the Messiah, and the story of one whose fruitfulness was long past, who was barren and yet was now with child. Two different pregnancies, both outside the box, both beyond what would have been considered normal for the people of that time. But God chose both of those families to work his plan through. So let's think about normal families. And I know some of you may say that's an oxymoron, because do we know a normal family? Most of us have families that have some element of tradition within them. A man marries a woman and they have babies. Okay, so we've got this traditional kind of family. But how many of us break out of tradition? How many of you have an adopted child somewhere that came into your family through adoption? I do. You got some adopted kids, anybody? All right, there's some. We've got adopted kids. All right, so families are made up of people who come in different ways. And today it's got a word for it. We didn't used to call it that way. But what about those who have remarried? And as a result of a new marriage, children have come in that were not born to that couple, but are part of the family nevertheless. Somebody got some blended families out there that you're related to? Yeah, a lot of blended families, okay, where we have new configurations of family. So all of these different configurations that we look at families is a little bit outside the box. As a matter of fact, I would challenge us to find very many extended families. Go back out to everybody who's still alive in your family. And most of us have something different in our family. Not just someone different, but something different about how they became part of our family. One time when I was working with a confirmation group, I put butcher paper up around the room. And I gave them cutout shapes of paper so that whether it was a mother or a stepmother or a father or a stepfather or sister or stepsister, whatever they were, I wanted them to graphically build me symbols of who lived in their house. And out of the 30-something kids that were part of that class, not one had a configuration that looked like any other configuration. All of them had different kinds of families. And I think that's what Jesus wants us to think about this season. Jesus comes to all kinds of families. God saw possibilities through these two women to show us that the idea of family need not be tightly bound in a box with a tightly defined definition, but that family is much bigger than that. We hear about Jesus' own family in that Mark reading, in the Mark 3 passage. We hear how Mary, his mother, and his brothers, it says, are outside or beyond where Jesus is speaking. And Jesus is talking to his disciples and others. Well, I would have guessed that his mother Mary and his brothers probably thought he was going a little nuts. Here was the good, solid son and brother that for 30 years had done what he was supposed to do. He'd done what his mother and father needed. He'd been a brother to his brothers. He worked in the carpenter shop. He'd done all the right things. And now, he's calling together these he called disciples and talking about being the Son of Man, being this Messiah that had been told about in the Old Testament and the Scriptures. And you know, his family is not sure exactly what's going on. They're thinking maybe he's starting to lose it a little bit. And yes, Mary always remembered in her heart the promises the angels made. But now that it was beginning to become public, it was a little higher, a little harder for them to acknowledge. And I'm thinking that they're probably standing out there saying, Jesus, why don't you just come on home with us here, brother? It's okay. You don't have to talk all that crazy stuff. These illusions of grandeur, don't let yourself get carried away. Come back to Nazareth and be a good boy. Let's get you back in the wood shop where you belong. Because, you know, our families have an idea of what we're supposed to be like. Our families have this idea of what they know us like. How many of you, especially when you were a young adult, would go back home to your parents' house after an extended visit, and your mom or even your dad tried to treat you like you were 10 years old again? They forgot you were 30, okay? They're reminding you to brush your teeth before you go to bed. Excuse me, got that one. Okay, don't need any help there. What do we do with our own adult children? Don't we fall back into some of those habits of trying to tell them things they don't need to be told? Because we're trying to keep them in the mold that we understand. We're trying to keep them in the box of what we understand them to be. You're my son, and this is the way you're meant to act. But nobody stays the same. And even who we are changes. And so here, Mary and her other sons can't understand why Jesus is acting this way. And they want to get him back in the box that they understand. They want him to stay focused on being that good son who lives in Nazareth and works in a carpenter's shop. How must they have felt to hear the way he was talking this stuff about Messiah? So much for normal, so much for tradition, so much for staying inside the family box. Jesus opens up our understanding of family. He wants us to understand that family is anyone who does the will of God. Who does the will of God. So when you think of family this Christmas season, who are you going to include? Just those who have bloodline ties to you? Or can we expand that concept of family just a little? Family is very important during our Christmas celebrations. And many of us enjoy the aspects of being with our families over Christmas. The gathering, the holiday meals, the gift exchange. But probably one or